So one of the kind of important, I think, dimensions, and this does point to, Pfaff's carefulness, though, because I don't want to make it seem like he's a careless writer, is that the Griot simultaneously is an ambivalent figure, right? And that's precisely because the issue of class, how class comes into it, class and the hierarchy, the hierarchical system of castes, right? I'm thinking of page 30. Because it is crucial that there is a distinction. It's not like there's a single Griot figure, right? But there's the Gyeol, and then the Lebka. And not only is there a distinction between class, there is also a gender distinction. So even here, this probably shouldn't be kind of horizontal, but a vertical model. And it is important to kind of keep in mind, right? On page 30, right? The Gyeol is someone who possesses mastery over the word and knowledge. This is about midway through. While the Lebkat is raconteur whose storytelling can be performed at any time by any member of a given community, heads of families or women, especially in such countries as Senegal. So there's a kind of administrative, sort of official, right, position or rank, as opposed to the kind of much more like kind of informal, right, which automatically puts the Gyeol over the Lebkat, right, and again the gender distinction too. So it is important to kind of keep this in mind. It is curious, right? So what is Pfaff saying necessarily? Pfaff doesn't, and again I think this is his carefulness. He's not necessarily saying whether Sembene is either Gyeol or Lebkat, right? I think to Sembene's credit, I would suggest he's probably, precisely in taking this category, he's probably including both, right? Especially because his films are so concerned with both class and gender. He is not someone who's explicitly trying to benefit from a kind of privileged position, right? On 30, let's see. Just a moment that I think is kind of, again, to his carefulness. In that second full paragraph near the bottom of the page, at the very bottom, he says, although the oral tradition is by no means limited to Africa, it is there that it probably remains the most popular and the most vital today. So that's a moment where he's trying to, again, kind of dialectically balance out both the universal and the particular. So he is saying it's not like Africa is the only place where there are oral traditions. But he is, the word probably is just not a precise enough word. So it's like, like when you're trying to make some sort of real claim or argument, you probably want to avoid probably. Just doesn't really help your case. Because he hasn't done the research. He's kind of just like speculating, right? He's wildly speculating. So we can kind of throw that out, right? To a certain degree. But his claim is that it's in Africa where the oral tradition is most likely the kind of strongest, right? By all intents and purposes. But the key, right, at the same time, is so if an oral tradition is the most lively in Africa in 1984, can we tie that from the fact, of its kind of just general, the conditions of Africa and the economic conditions, right, and the living conditions? Probably not, right? And, again, with oral traditions, and it comes up in the reading at one point too, the question of literacy, right, and education, and free education, and freely available education, right, which, clearly is on my mind, and I think is probably on your mind too, in relation to all of this, right? Access to education. Do you have access? Is it oral by choice, right, in Africa? If we even take this for a moment and say yeah, maybe he's right, maybe oral traditions are alive, but is that by choice or is it a question of access? These are difficult questions, right? And we have to do our due diligence to, kind of not avoid them entirely. On 31, I guess, he says this himself, right? The historical dimension is that oral literature, right? It's really close relationship with what? a communal, like the community, right? The collective custom, but that it's also that this is a largely illiterate and agricultural society for the most part. Let's see. Yeah, this is the first partial paragraph on 31. I've already kind of brought this up too, right? Sorry, I'm just gonna. But yeah, you know, and the fact that Pfaff is bringing, like, sort of mentioning these kind of distinctly actual historical conditions points to the fact that this isn't just a sort of, you know, mindless romanticism, right? Okay, so when we're thinking, I've already kind of mentioned this, but we're thinking about the movement of African oral culture, right? Whether it's moving in the country itself, or we think about, you know, like, and yeah, I think a direct analogy is if we think about the movement of African American culture as well in the U.S., and of course those kind of the genealogy and the lineages that do go back to continental Africa. And he brings this up too, right? Especially, again, going back etymologically on 31, but colonialism, right? The slave trade and globalism, right? You know, and especially if we think about, like, you know, especially, oh, I'm out of frame. Our moment, neoliberal globalism, you know, how do things actually move? Right. Okay. So when Pfaff actually starts talking about African cinema, he mostly, and this is, again, to kind of go back to things I've already said, to me this is kind of, I kind of have a beef with this, but it's, you know, it's this issue, it's like narrative, right? So it's like, the Griot tells stories, historically, traditionally, you know, Africans have told stories, and Sembene is telling stories. Like, that's basically where it kind of goes, right? And this becomes the bridge between, you know, with cinema, right? On 32, when he kind of breaks down, what about it, right? This is Ethiopian filmmaker, so another African filmmaker, Haile Gerima, that what makes African cinema African is the oral tradition as part of African film aesthetics in terms of space, pace, and rhythms. So film aesthetics, right? The idea of what becomes regional is what is aesthetic, right? And what is aesthetically pleasing. So space, pace, rhythm. But, you know, I think what's crucial here, right, is space, pace, and rhythm can be largely narrative, but they're not dependent on narrative, right? On 34, and I think this is at the very top, you know, with the partial paragraph. As we see with cinema that's not classical American Hollywood cinema, classical Hollywood narrative, as we've seen in other movements like the French New Wave, right, is that Sembene prefers character types rather than characters with psychology, right? So the narrative, again, you know, has this kind of more a metaphoric rather than a kind of literal function, right? So I do want you, as you're watching Hala, and I'll give you a link to Black Girl as well, which is another film that I generally teach more than Hala. I do want you to be thinking kind of more broadly in terms of, and of course I want to hear from you on the discussion board when we continue our conversation, but I do want you to be thinking about the aesthetics of Sembene. What makes a Sembene film a Sembene film? Because again, ultimately, we, both Faf, Sembene, and myself, and we were kind of, proceeding in a sort of auteurist function, right, in fashion. And so that would be the other kind of big kind of task and question, is for us to think about the history of African cinema that's not entirely just sort of, linked to one person or a few people, right? So finally, the problem, there's a real difficulty in doing, I think, what Faf is doing here, which is, I brought this up in terms of thinking about Japan. When encountering the sort of international or the foreign, right, the kind of desire, right, to sort of link it to the pre-modern, and especially in terms of economic development. So with third cinema, which we didn't get to, there's a way in which the third is a self-designation, taking, of course, like the classic schema of first, second, and third world, and suggests a space that hasn't been kind of represented. But that sort of primarily economic distinction to this day, right, is one to sort of that kind of cruelly marks a sort of a race or a game where people are falling behind, right? And even, so Frantz Fanon, of course, who's come up before, sort of looms in the background mightily of all of this. And what Fanon is very, and his collaborator Sartre, as we've seen in Battle of Algiers, they're both like very quick to point out is that colonialism can also, it's not just a kind of denigrating force. It can also be one that's a fetishizing force, so that an adoration and an adulation comes out of colonialism as well. Sembene is very good at sort of pointing that out too. And so even what we have to be careful in sort of a celebration of something like African cinema, and especially kind of tying it to some sort of like ancient tradition, is that that kind of mythical, right, approach can also kind of very quickly devolve into like the mystical as well, right? Which, and what I'm trying to point out is that like all of this can kind of very quickly devolve into the colonial sort of mindset of the idea of the other as undeveloped, as uncivilized, as barbaric, right? Yes, there. Historically, we know there is an oral tradition. We know that like there are myths in Africa in the way that there are anywhere else. So how we deal, it's not those facts as such, but how we deal with those. And again, how we deal with those in a sort of historical sense, I think, is the way out of this kind of thinking, that it doesn't become this kind of essentialist, lazy thing where it's like, oh, well, this is Africa, like there's oral tradition and this is what it means, da 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 da. And so in that sense, I think where I want to leave off with before we kind of move into the film and then into the reading for Thursday are these kind of very specific questions that I think Faf doesn't really field, to my like anyway. Is like, what do we do with the politics, right? And what do we do with the history? And specifically, what I mean by that is, what do we do with, for example, another scholar, Kenneth W. Harrow's claim that Sembene cinema is actually more indebted to Soviet cinema than rather to kind of like these sort of pre-modern African traditions, and rather that it's less about like this kind of representing some sort of like deep kind of authentic root to African culture, but rather the culture of decolonization and to post-liberation, right? Because if we look on 37, right, Faf actually kind of, I mean, he addresses this, right? This is the very top. Thus, one might rightly wonder if the conflicting elements of Sembene's cinematic art are not more related to African. Well, actually, I guess he's actually allowing for it to a certain degree, but you know, for the rest of the reading, not really. But I'll just want to end with this. Related to African oral storytelling rather than solely, as many critics have pointed out, to the Marxist tendencies of his ideology. So, his ideology, meaning Sembene's, his indebtedness to Soviet cinema. Because Soviet cinema, you know, like that is the kind of legacy, is that simultaneously, it's not just ideological, which is where these are aligning, but in terms of like what it actually did for cinema as well, is kind of really where we see the sort of kind of long-lasting, you know, effects of Soviet cinema. But what do we do with that, right? Like, because you know, it is something that sort of tempers, right, Pfaff's account that it's not, you know, pre-modern oral traditions, but rather decidedly modern, you know, Marxist ideology. Okay, so again, let me know if you have any questions. Looking forward to talking further on the boards, and I will see you soon.